Welcome everyone to another session of Experience Week. We're thrilled to have all of you here and especially grateful to have Senator Jeff Flake from Arizona here with us today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Appreciate you being here. So as you know, this is Experience Week. We're talking with people about all the experiences that they provide with their brands, their products, their services, etc. Yours is a special one that we're thrilled to dive into, which is the constituent experience and how you can help serve all those in the community that you represent, specifically the state of Arizona. If I could, before we dive into some of those specifics, just ask you a little bit about your feelings on leadership, what it is and how one applies leadership in today's political environment.
Political environment, I'm often asked, do you believe in the delegate model or the representation model? Are you a delegate in Washington or representative? Do you represent the views of your constituents or vote your conscience? And obviously it's a combination of the two. You run for office on a platform. Say, this is what I plan to do. This is my philosophy. This is what I stand for. And then you'll get there. But my own view is, once you're there, you vote your conscience. And you've let your constituents know, and the voters know what you stand for. But you certainly don't want to, put a finger in the wind whenever an issue comes up. Because that's what representative democracy is all about. You run on something, you get elected, and then you vote your conscience.
Let me ask you about that a little more. You talked about putting your finger to the wind. There's this idea that you want to make sure you know what your constituents feel and believe, but you also don't want to be governed by polls.
Oh, definitely.
So walk me through how you make sure that you're listening, you're aware, you represent what they hope you will, but also not governed by polls.
You can never get too far away from what your constituents want if you're running for re-election, which every elected official is. And so my point is that you simply can't afford on every issue to say, all right, let's look at the calls into the office. If there are more calls in favor of this bill or this amendment, then I'll vote for it. It's imprecise that way. Or one of the examples that I can give is one where you might think that I went against the views of my constituents, but it was back when I was in the House of Representatives. I served 6 terms there. So every 2 years in the House especially, you're going back to the voters, so you know what they think. But there was an issue called the prescription drug benefit, or Medicare Part D. And it was a proposal to add a new part to Medicare, which obviously a lot of seniors were having difficulty affording prescription drugs. This would have subsidized those drugs. So seniors liked it, obviously. And I represented in Arizona a number of retirement communities. And a big part of the vote is always, particularly in a Republican election, are seniors. And if I had taken a poll, believe me, the majority in that poll, likely voters would have said, yeah, we want this prescription drug benefit. But you have to balance that as an elected official against, can we afford it? Does this simply shift burdens to the next generation? And so you can't always say, that's where the voters are, that's where I'm going to be. I think part of your job as an elected official is to say, here's why we can do this, or here's why we can't do this, and I'm going to vote my conscience and then go and try to explain to the voters why I voted this way. And sometimes you can reconcile that with the voters and sometimes you can't. But the last thing I think the voters need is somebody who goes to Washington and just said, I'm just going to vote however my constituents want. I'm not going to try to educate or to push them one direction or another, because if we just had polls, then we wouldn't need representative democracy. And so politics is different from business in that way.
So let me ask you about leadership gaps. I don't think anyone would argue that in the nation and in the world today there's a dearth of leadership in many areas. There's the expectation people have and then the reality that we get. And that's true in anything, right? The expectation you have when you buy a product and the reality of what you experience when you get it. Sometimes there's a gap between those two.
Right.
What are your thoughts on closing this leadership gap? How do we do it, and what does that look like?
Well, it has to be frustrating to voters out there, particularly in the situation we're in now. You have one party, which happens to be the party I belong to, the Republicans, who control the House and the Senate and the White House. And so the expectation among those who voted us in, Republican voters, is, boy, you should be passing legislation every week. The reality is this is a legislative body. And even though we all may belong to the Republican Party, there are variations certainly within the party. And so it is frustrating, I'm sure, to the voters, and sometimes frustrating to many of us when we can't get all of our colleagues together in a legislative body to move forward on something. But in terms of leadership, I think the role of a good legislator is to lead, to basically say, all right, here, we can't do this all with just Republicans. Democrats realize the same. They can't do it on their side. And so let's find some coalitions that we can put together. Let's get together. And unfortunately, these days, if you work across the aisle, it's usually considered a gang, a gang of 6, a gang of 8. 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, or 4 and 4. Like it's some illicit activity to work across the aisle. And that's more true today than it's ever been, and it's unfortunate.
On that topic, a lot of people will go into their jobs and they'll find that they're working with people that they don't agree with.
Right.
Your job is more extreme than
right.
probably any other in that regard. Yeah. But I think any of the people watching this will recognize that they've worked with people that they don't see eye to eye with. What's your advice, having been in this House and now the Senate, to work with people that you have fundamental disagreements with, but you still have to get something done?
Well, that's the nature of legislating. You can't afford to write somebody off because they disagree with you on one issue, because they might agree with you on something else. And the Senate is different from the House in that in the House, the majority rules everything. If you have 218 as opposed to 217, then as the majority, if you stay together as a body, you can push through whatever. In the Senate, it's not that way. The Senate requires a supermajority, 60 votes for almost anything. To bring most things to the floor, you have to get unanimous consent. So everybody has to agree. Only one senator can hold out and block something. So it's taken to the extreme in the body where I'm in, the Senate, because it's easy for one person just to obstruct. So you have to make sure that you don't have any permanent enemies, because that bill that you want to bring to the floor can usually be blocked by one person. And so it does teach you to reach across the aisle, to obviously look for opportunities to forge alliances and friendships across the aisle, because you're going to need it if you want to be effective. Sometimes people think being effective is just being able to stand up and say, here's what I stand for. Nobody else will come with me. I'm purer than everybody. But that person is usually unable to push legislation across the finish line.
Mm-hmm. Any specific examples or lessons that you think people could apply in how they build those relationships, what it looks like, how to make sure you don't develop permanent enemies, as you say?
Well, I mean, I think one thing you have to recognize is if somebody's opposing you on one issue, whether it's in a work environment, legislative environment, they may be with you on the next issue. And that's certainly what I've learned. Depending on what your own philosophy is, you may be on a different side of somebody on tax policy, for example. If they're on the other side of the aisle, you may be a Republican and want to cut taxes, or you may be on the other side and want a different outcome. But on civil liberties issues, it may be something you agree on. Privacy issues. There are any variation of issues where somebody may be opposed to you in one sphere, but be with you on another, and that's that takes a while sometimes to learn, that you just can't go out and vilify the other side or assign bad motives to somebody, because you're going to need them on something else.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's a great lesson that I think all of us have seen in so many aspects of our lives. Talk to me then on this topic of being able to move beyond certain issues. You're obviously disagreeing with people. How do you make sure that it doesn't become personal? I'm sure there have been moments where you thought you'd agreed to something and someone changes their mind last minute. How do you elevate that, and what's your advice to our watchers?
Well, a lot of it is, the nice thing about the Senate, there are only 100, and you get to know each other. Usually you serve on committees, or you develop friendships other ways. And if you can develop a level of trust, if you've worked with people long enough, then you can usually get beyond the kind of problems that plague those who don't know each other very well. A few years ago, we were having such trouble in the Senate getting along and moving things along that I teamed up with one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, Martin Heinrich, a senator from New Mexico. We were elected at the same time to the Senate. We decided to prove to the extreme that a Republican and a Democrat could get along. And so we cooked up an idea to maroon ourselves on an island and see if we could survive together, just relying on each other. And Discovery Channel thought that was a good idea. We quietly worked with them, and they came and filmed us for a week in the Marshall Islands in the middle of the Pacific. A Republican and a Democrat. About all we had was a machete between us, and no food or water, and we had to survive for a week. It was a great experience. It was. We returned, and none of our colleagues knew that we had done this. It was a surprise to them. I think it was Stephen Colbert ran a clip of us out there spearing fish and surviving. He said, Flake and Heinrich proved once and for all that Republicans and Democrats can get along if death is the only option. So for what it's worth, we now have empirical evidence that it can happen. But part of the problem in Washington is it used to be that families or members of the House or the Senate, when they were elected, they would move to Washington and move their family back there. In fact, Mo Udall, who represented Arizona back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, wrote a book. And in the 1960s, members of Congress were given a budget that allowed them to fly back home to their state, in this case Arizona, about 3 times a year. And so obviously they moved their families back. And what that did was Republicans, Democrats, all of them, their kids were enrolled in the same schools. They socialized together on the weekends. And they developed levels of trust that you just don't see today. And so it's more difficult today with a commuter Congress, where we go back to Washington typically on a Monday and work for a few days and then go back to our state or our district on the weekends. And you never develop the kind of trust that is sometimes required to work together on legislation. And so it's more difficult now. It still can be done. You may have to maroon yourself on an island, but it's desperately needed.
Yeah. I'm guessing most people are not up for that.
No. I often get the question, which of your colleagues would you like to pair up and see survive together? Or more often I'm asked which of my colleagues I'd like to leave on an island.
Right. I was going to say, there was an old meme going around during the last election. Who wins if you put Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton on a deserted island? And it said, America wins. America wins.
I could have guessed that.
So going back to a topic we've sort of addressed, you represent all of Arizona.
Right.
Not all of Arizona votes for you. How do you make sure that as a leader, that you are representing everyone, that they feel their voices are heard, et cetera, not just the group that votes for you?
That's a great point. When I won 53% of the vote, so barely half. And you have to recognize as well that only about half of those who are eligible to vote do. And so you've been sent to Washington by about a quarter of the voters or potential voters of the state. So that's a bit humbling. You know that about half of the state that voted for your opponent. And you represent the whole state. And so you do have to recognize that, that you represent their interests as well. Your office, when it does constituent service, whether people have issues with Social Security or the Veterans Administration, whether they're Democrat or Republican, you never ask, did you vote for me, before you help them. And so at a constituent services level, it's, you represent everyone. But it does come to a head when people, advocacy groups and others form and want you to support a position that philosophically you may not agree with. And those are just trade-offs that you make. Those are decisions that you balance your own philosophy, your platform when you ran, and what you think ought to be done in Washington with the needs of your constituents and with what what they need as people, whether they live in Snowflake, where I grew up, in a small community, or a metropolitan area like Phoenix today. But like I said, you always have to go back for re-election. You can never get too far away from what the people want, or you won't be re-elected.
Let's go into this topic of constituent services, because I think we hear most about everyone saying, hey, call your senator, call your congressperson, right. Tell them what you think about this or that policy issue. Mm-hmm. But a lot of what also happens in your offices are people are calling because they're not getting their Social Security check, right, or not getting their veterans benefits. Mm-hmm. Can you walk us through an example or two, or how that works?
Oh, sure. I get calls from family members who will say, hey, can you intervene here? Or friends of friends, or just somebody out of the blue will call because they've been told to call your senator. And we all have state offices. So I have an office in Tucson. I have an office in Phoenix. I have staff that will do field days where they'll go to a community where we don't have an office, like Prescott, and have people come and say, what are your issues with the Veterans Administration, with Medicare? One thing that we get a lot of requests on are immigration issues, or somebody who will have a son or a daughter in a different country, and they've lost their passport, for example, things like that. Or in the extreme of, you've had a family member who has died overseas and you're trying to get the body back home. Just any number of issues. Or somebody traveling to Mexico, just across the border, didn't realize they had their hunting rifle in their trunk, and was discovered, and now they're in a jail in Mexico. Mm-hmm. Can you help them there? The number of issues that you deal with are broad and varied, and it's very gratifying, though, as well. Also, things like every senator and member of the House makes recommendations to the military academies, and so you get to go out to the schools and tell people what opportunities there are to go to West Point or the Naval Academy, and those nominations can only come through your senator or your member of the House. So there are a number of ways that you interact with the public, with your constituency, that some of them are a lot of fun. Some of them are repetitive, and you just do it again and again. But you always have to remember, hey, you signed up for this. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, I've had a great staff that works well with the public, and that's, you'd better do that. You'd better talk to your predecessor, find out what works, what doesn't. If he or she had good staff, you usually hire them because those are important positions.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I think that's an area that a lot of people are not familiar with. That they don't know those opportunities and options and,
right,
and the things that you guys do. One thing I want to talk about, you've recently released a book, Conscience of a Conservative. A lot of people look at that and say, congratulations, you're taking a courageous stand. You're saying things that may be unpopular.
Right.
Everyone watching this will or has been in a situation where they'll have to take a stand on principle that may not be the most popular or expedient thing to do. Can you walk us through your decision, why you did it, how you feel, and advice to people as they face those same decisions?
Well, the book that I wrote is titled Conscience of a Conservative. If that title sounds familiar to some,
Yes.
it's the same title of a book by Barry Goldwater, one of my political heroes, who was a Republican, ran for president in the 60s. In 1960, he looked at the conservative movement and the Republican Party and thought that it had been compromised by the New Deal. And he felt that he needed to write a blueprint as to what conservative policy should be. And that has kind of been the Bible for conservatives for several decades. I looked at today's Republican Party, and what I saw several months ago was a party that was given into the politics of populism, like things that may play well in an election, but aren't a governing philosophy, nothing you can go back and pass legislation on, things, or should pass legislation on. Things like protectionism or nativism, anti-immigration fervor. That typically hasn't been where the Republican Party has stood, but that's kind of where we are now after this last election. And it's not very often that somebody who's up for re-election will write a book
right.
in that election year, and I certainly weighed that. I didn't tell my staff on the campaign or my official staff that I was writing this book. They didn't know until just a few weeks before it came out. And I did that because I felt it was important enough that somebody speak out when it mattered. If I had waited until I was safely reelected and then wrote a book, it wouldn't be as meaningful. This book is not just a critique of the current president or that campaign, but it's, I think, a warning to Republicans that if we follow this populist path, we can win an election here or there, but it's no way to govern. It doesn't achieve the conservative ends that we've all sought. And so that's why I wrote the book. I don't know if I would recommend it to somebody else. Some people think, you shouldn't do that. You make your re-election more difficult. That's probably true. But I felt that it was important enough to write it.
And an important example in many ways. I mean, we've got people watching who have been whistleblowers at their companies or who have resigned a position because of X or Y. And it's important to have that those type of principles that you can stand on and say, this is what's important and this is why.
You have to sleep at night and you have to feel good about what you're doing. And I enjoy this job. I enjoy what I'm doing. But I think it's important to stand up, and particularly when you see the party that you have grown up in and that you love, and these principles that have animated the party for so long being kind of pushed aside in favor of a banner that is unfamiliar to a lot of us. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I wrote the book.
Mario Cuomo said that we campaign in poetry and govern in prose. You've talked a lot about the importance of building relationships and developing trust and how that helps to facilitate actual legislation and getting things done. We've seen a lot, I don't know if I'll call it poetry, but we've seen a lot of campaigning in poetry, if you will. But the campaigning or legislating in prose maybe isn't working.
Right.
Beyond forming great relationships and figuring out how to work as individuals, what do you see as the solution to move us forward? Well,
I think first and foremost, you have to, if you're going to legislate, you've got to first have policy that lends itself to legislating before you can get together and work things out. And my concern has been that some of the campaign rhetoric that we talk about. I often point out, for a politician running for office, it's easy to point to a shuttered factory and say, that was a free trade agreement. That's why that factory closed. Or it's this reason or that reason, when the truth is it's always far more complex. It's automation, modernization. And sometimes in a campaign, we pine away for or age that just doesn't exist anymore.
Sure.
And so you have to have real solutions to problems that come along with modernization and automation. And so first you have to have some real policy answers before you can say, all right, let's form coalitions to solve it. And that's been my biggest problem with the direction, with populism in general. What plays in a campaign doesn't necessarily play well when you're trying to legislate. And then when you can't legislate it,
right,
people get frustrated. They say you didn't hold to your promises in the campaign. And so I think you first have to be honest, more honest during a campaign. You always, will dress things up and certainly speak to your audience in a way. I mean, that's campaigning. I think we all recognize that. But if you promise things that just you cannot deliver on, then it just leads to cynicism that really poses problems in the long term. I think that's kind of where we are now.
One thing that we've talked about, another person who's got a video here at Experience Week, is Angela Duckworth, the author of Grit. She talks about how important that is to continue to persevere, your level of effort, etc. You recently wrote a New York Times op-ed talking about how we need people with great skills, and one incredible skill is hard work.
Right.
And specifically on the issue of immigration. But I'd love for you to share some examples of hard work, how people develop that skill, why it's important, why grit matters so much.
Well, the article you mentioned, I grew up on a farm and a ranch. I had 10 brothers and sisters. It was tough, a much different kind of work than I experience now. Now I shower in the morning rather than the evening. I think the other way probably more honorable. But I think the importance of grit and perseverance, if you've had experience where you have physical labor and you can do a job, and what I miss most about the ranch and the farm is being able to do a job and be finished at the end of the day, at least until the next day.
Sure.
And just to put it aside and relax. And that's more difficult to do these days. So perseverance, probably a little tougher. It was more intermittent, maybe, in the atmosphere I grew up in than now. It's just kind of constant. The importance of sticking to it, whatever you choose to do, and seeing it through. You can't overstate that. I think any successful person has some element of being able to overcome obstacles, or just taking an idea and doggedly pursuing it for a long time. I don't know that I'm the example of that or not, but I try.
Yeah. On going to Snowflake, where you grew up, you mentioned having 10 brothers and sisters, growing up on a ranch. What are the lessons that you would share with us from that we can all take to being good leaders, to being good citizens, to being good members of our community, our companies, etc.?
Right. Eat fast, or the food will be gone by the end of or by the middle of the meal. No, be in the middle of 11 kids. It's number 5. People often ask, were you longing for affection or longing for love? And I say, no, honestly, I was just longing for food. I'd give all the affection in the world for seconds on dessert once or twice. But I couldn't have had a better childhood in that way, though. And I look back and I see, for me as an elected official, I look at examples that I had growing up. My father was the mayor of Snowflake. That came by rotation. He volunteered, obviously, in our church and in other community activities, but he did a stint as mayor, not because he wanted the perks of office to be mayor of a small town, but he just knew that was a responsibility that he had. My uncle, whose name was Jake Flake of Snowflake, was Speaker of the House in Arizona for several years, one of the most beloved legislators we had, and he was beloved because he had grown up obviously on a ranch himself, and he knew that if you don't do the job, it just doesn't get done. If you don't milk the cow's not going to be milked. If you don't brand the calves, nobody else is going to do it for you. And that is sometimes kind of lost these days in politics. If you don't pass a budget, you can just pass a continuing resolution and act as if you did. You can easily kick the can down the road easier than the examples I saw growing up of my father and his brothers and my mother and others that, it had to get done. If you didn't do it, nobody would. I'm grateful for that example that I had.
Yeah. Let me end with this. If you could do one thing unilaterally to change the political world, to change a piece of legislation, anything that is, to hopefully get things functioning more, what would that be?
To find a way to have voters more accepting of, particularly primary voters, those who reach across the aisle, and realize that in any legislative body, there are compromises that are made, that you stick to principle, but you might only get 80% of what you want, but 80% is better than nothing. And if I could, I guess, have any wish, it'd be that was valued more out there. I think it used to be. Now there are other values that I think are ascendant, and that makes it more difficult to actually legislate. So anyway, that may not make sense, but that's my view.
Makes sense to me. Well, thank you so much for joining us today as part of Experience Week, and thanks to all of you. Please stay tuned for additional sessions coming up.